In the Midwest, there's nothing we love more than the underdogs. And talking about players who are underrated can sometimes get kind of volatile because everybody believes that their favorite player is underrated. But who are the players in the AFC North that are actually underrated? Well, this week, I'm going to go through them. I'm going to talk about the most underrated players on each team's roster in the AFC North. And it's going to start right after this. Real quick, before I talk about the most underrated players in the AFC North, I want to make sure that you guys click that subscribe button and ding that notification bell so you can be notified when I upload. The NFL season is going to go in full swing in about 4 to 5 days, so make sure you're locked and loaded here so you can get all the content coming. It's going to be lovely. Without further ado, let's jump into the video. Now, as much as I went off about how the Pittsburgh Steelers have a ton of overrated pieces, they also have some pieces that, because they overrated specific pieces on their defense, are now underrated, and some pieces on their offense. And Joe Hayden, I think, is a prime example of that. Joe Hayden has lasted much longer than anybody has expected him to. Going into his 10th year, he looked done in his 6th year in Cleveland. We thought he was done in 2016, but he has revived his career and had some very, very, very solid years in Pittsburgh. Not that shutdown corner that he was in 2013, 2014, where he did some ridiculous things to Julio Jones and AJ Green, but very good. Very good corner still. Plays at a high level, and I think he's as instrumental to that defensive success as Minkah Fitzpatrick. And what I mean by that is that if Joe Hayden's not there, then I still think the holes in the secondary are too big to overcome for that defense to really be dominant. And the same thing happens if Minkah's not there. That hole kind of becomes too difficult to replace. So Joe Hayden, I think, is an integral part to the success of that defense in Pittsburgh. I don't think he gets the credit that he deserves on there. And for honorable mention, I have first Cam Hayward mentioned on this list. I think Cam Hayward, he's been good for so long that people just kind of forget how good Cam Hayward has been. He's been a shoo-in for 8 sacks and double-digit TFLs for the last 2 seasons. And then I chose somebody on offense for the other honorable mention. That's James Washington. I think he did a lot more with less than somebody like a Juju Smith-Schuster did. Now, Juju did a lot with Big Ben and AB alongside of him, but when asked to be the number one, he kind of faltered. James Washington kind of stepped up last year, being the number one option at the end of the season for Pittsburgh, and Juju kind of was relegated to a secondary role. And I think James Washington did a lot with that. I think he carried some bad quarterback play, and I think he didn't fall into the sea of excuses that people have fallen into with Juju Smith-Schuster when trying to excuse that season. I mean, James Washington had the same bad quarterback play, had a much better year than Juju Smith-Schuster, and I expect to see a lot out of him if Big Ben can decide that he's worthy of throwing the ball, because that has been an issue in the last few years. Cincinnati has a ton of underrated players. I think Cincinnati is a very underrated team, and one guy who has been underrated forever, I don't understand it at this point, is Carlos Dunlap. He is one of the most underappreciated and most consistent performers in all of the AFC North. I don't think there's a lot of people who have a resume that stacks up to it. He has had 81.5 sacks in the last 9 years, and he has been consistent with those numbers. That's not like a ton of sacks one year and then 2 sacks the next year. These are all consistent production from Carlos Dunlap. We talk about somebody else who's on this list, Cam Hayward, who has had 54 sacks in that same span. Geno Atkins, taken in the same draft as Carlos Dunlap, been on the same team as Carlos Dunlap, and is seen as a star instead of Carlos Dunlap. He's had 75. Carlos, again, 81.5. Even Calais Campbell, who is currently right now the highest rated player on Madden on the Baltimore Ravens, a team that went 14-2 last year and had the MVP. Calais Campbell has 81. Carlos Dunlap, 81.5. This man is so underrated, it's disgusting. I've always known that Carlos Dunlap was a good player. I did not know how good until I looked at his stats. And while some people are going to argue one way or the other that his stats might be empty, the Cincinnati Bengals have been very good when he was there. He has been a huge part of that defense over the years. And I think Carlos Dunlap's just one of those names that just because he plays in Cincinnati and people don't pay attention to Cincinnati, we don't remember a lot. We don't think of when it comes to the conversations of some of the best defensive linemen in the AFC North, but Carlos Dunlap's definitely there. Honorable mention is Tyler Boyd and William Jackson. I don't have much to say about both these players. I just think they've been really good and kind of fall into that Carlos Dunlap syndrome that he has fallen into, where you put up all this production, but just because you're not loud and you play in Cincinnati, you kind of get forgotten about. Now we're going to talk about the Baltimore Ravens, and the Baltimore Ravens have an interesting selection of underrated players. First of which I'm going to say is Marlon Humphrey. I don't think the recognition for this guy's level of play last year has been acknowledged to the point to where I would be satisfied if I were a huge Marlon Humphrey fan. I think he was the best defensive back in the AFC North last year, and that includes all the safeties, all the guys on Pittsburgh's roster, all the people who got all this hype. I think he was much better then. I think he's the best defensive back, period, in the AFC North. And I think he will continue to do that. This guy has size, strength, speed, technique, and he can tackle well. He's one of the best corners in the NFL, but he consistently gets ranked lower than Marcus Peters. He doesn't get the respect that he deserves on any type of rankings list. And this is a guy who thoroughly shut down OBJ. Like, name me the dominant wide receiver that the Ravens had an issue stopping last year. And that's solely because of Marlon Humphreys. He was asked to shadow number one guys in a man situation with really little help over top, because ET usually does his own thing and doesn't stay in the structure of the offense. But rarely was he burnt. Rarely was he beaten down. Rarely did somebody ever dominate him. And he played a lot of good wide receivers last year. Marlon Humphrey is one of the best defensive backs in the NFL. Nobody's saying it, though. The next honorable mention goes to Gus Edwards. This is a guy I like a lot, and if he ends up getting off of Baltimore's roster in the next year or two, because they have so much talent there with the recent draft picks and Mark Ingram and how they use Lamar Jackson, this is a guy who I would think is going to shine on the other team that he goes to. Gus, despite having to get limited carries behind multiple running backs over the years, Mark Ingram, Kenneth Dixon, he still put up good numbers. He has put up good numbers last year. He averages more per carry than Mark Ingram does. He's a big, physical, pounding back that I like a lot. I think he's really solidified himself as an NFL player over the last 2 years by getting in shape and really adding a level of explosiveness to his game that wasn't there. I really like what Gus Edwards brings to the team. I think that Gus Edwards is very underrated in that aspect. Another guy who is underrated is Matt Judon. This guy has developed himself into a legit threat at defensive end. And I thought the thought of him being that at the start of last season was kind of laughable, but he has proved me wrong all the way. So I can't help but think that Matt Judon is a little underrated at this point. And now with Cleveland, underrated is again hard, right? Because none of these guys are criminally underrated or not talked about enough. Browns fans, we might think they are criminally underrated, but they're not. They get their flowers in one way or the other, and they get talked about a lot. And this guy, Jarvis Landry, I think is a clear case of that. This is a guy that a lot of people in the NFL appreciate. A lot of guys love Jarvis Landry. But I think Jarvis Landry's place as far as the top receivers in the NFL kind of never gets to where it should be. I think people have a ceiling in their mind of what Jarvis Landry is capable of and kind of don't let him break out of that box. I think people see him as a top 20 to 15 guy maximum, but I don't see him as a top 10 guy. But last year, I think he was a top 10 guy. OBJ wasn't, but he stepped up and did so, and I think Jarvis Landry is one of the better wide receivers in the NFL. From a hand standpoint, he's definitely there. From a spectacular catch standpoint, he's definitely there. From a route running standpoint, he's definitely there. From a production standpoint, he's definitely there. From a versatility standpoint, Jarvis Landry is no doubtedly there. Sure, he doesn't have the size, and sure, he doesn't have the speed, but he makes up for that in leaping ability and pure route running ability. I've seen him just get open in situations he should not get open because he is just that good and that quick and that explosive. So Jarvis Landry does not get the respect he deserves as a top tier wide receiver. He does get the respect that he deserves as a top level wide receiver, right? But I think people put him in a box I don't think he belongs into. I don't think it's that clear of a designation after last season that he's below OBJ. Now, OBJ might blow that out the water and become the best receiver in the NFL again. But as of right now, there are two top tier receivers in Cleveland that are pretty much on the same level. Rashard Higgins is another guy I think is very underrated. He was probably most underrated by Freddie Kitchens last year, shots fired. But Higgins in 2018 as the third option had 572 yards and 4 touchdowns, and that's work as a third option. It's really good numbers as a third option. Now, he did not carry that success into 2019, so he's kind of fallen off a cliff, almost like had a hard time staying on a roster, quite frankly. Had to sign like a minimum deal with Cleveland in order to stay on here. But I think this is a guy who's going to be a valuable slot option. I think he's going to do a lot of what BC Johnson did in Minnesota that made him so valuable, but at a higher level. I really like what Rashard Higgins brings to the table. Good route runner, good hands, is actually a lot more athletic than people think he is. And I'm excited to see what he's going to do in the offense like Kevin Stefanski's. Another guy I think is underrated on the Cleveland Browns is J.C. Tretter. He is really reliable. He's been really good. He stayed healthy, which was the big thing that he was going against when the Browns signed him from Green Bay, was that he doesn't stay healthy. But he's been able to stay healthy, and the combination of him and Joe Bitonio has not given up more than like 1 sack in the last 27 games that they have played together. So that's really good. Joe Thomas would be proud of J.C. Tretter. J.C. Tretter, one of the better centers in the NFL that nobody talks about, even among people who are offensive lineman enthusiasts. So I just want to give that respect to J.C. Tretter. But that's my thoughts on the most underrated players in the AFC North. Let me know your thoughts down in the comment section below. But again, guys, thank you for watching. Have a great day. Have a good night.